welcome everybody. We'll get started here if you want to find a seat. Thanks for allowing me to come to your meeting today. My name is Jared Knock. I come from Willow Lake, South Dakota. Willow Lake is from Hendricks about 70 miles directly to the west. And I remember the first time I ever left the state of South Dakota, we went over to Hendricks, Minnesota and picked up some dairy heifers. We used to milk cows. Milked about 80 to 100 Great Holstein cows when I was growing up, sure like a lot of folks did in Minnesota and eastern South Dakota. And now we have a bit of a different operation. I'll tell you a little bit about that and kind of the context of what I want to talk to you about today. So I'll explain a little bit more about myself and about the company that we helped found and I worked for called AgSpire about 3 years ago. And then really my goal is to give you just an idea of, we all know that there's soil health incentives out there. We know that there's government dollars. We know that there's carbon credits, people kind of coming around to the soil health movement. Many of the people in this room, in fact, most of you, I have no doubt, have invested into soil health for the reasons that it offers for you on your farms. You found a more resilient way to run your operations. You see the benefits of what it does for your land, the investment that you have. It allows you more grazing opportunities for livestock, perhaps. You're seeing the direct benefits on your farm. So my point is for people is not to adopt soil health merely for what these payments might represent, but for those of you folks that are really the early adopters and those that are interested in doing more of these practices, about what maybe is out there that makes sense or not sense for you to engage with, and what's behind it and where it's coming from, so that you're more aware when you're taking incentive dollars on where they might be coming from and what that really might mean. So again, my wife Katie and I, we have 3 girls. We live on a diversified crop livestock operation. We have a commercial cow-calf herd, a commercial ewe flock. We have a couple hog finishing barns. We have a corn, soybean, oat rotation primarily, but we also do some alternative forages, Sudan grass and millet. We have a fair amount of alfalfa acres that we use for hay production as well. And then about 60% or 50 to 60% of our total footprint as a farm and ranch is in perennial pastures, most of that being native, a few of those being native restored pastures that we've done over the last 10 years. When I moved back home from the corporate world, it's been almost 12 years ago now, really the goal was to find out ways to be more efficient, more resilient, garner more income, more net income from the same land base that my parents were operating on before. So we had to get very creative in the different ways that we do that. Hence, that's kind of when the sheep came into the picture, because it was one of those things that when you're starting off farming, with a few hog panels, a couple 5-gallon buckets, and a square baler, and you can get into business. It was at that time, bred heifers would have brought about $3,000 a piece back in 2015, and you could buy kind of a short-term ewe from western states, from Wyoming and western South Dakota for $100. So figured maybe we'd buy 30 head of breeding ewes instead of 1 bred heifer at the time, and it's been a good investment, a good diversification for us. But my goals in our operation, and my wife and I, we sat down and kind of shared these with my parents and kind of got their input, was really to just talk about what's important to us and why it matters. And all our decisions based on our operation are based on these core priorities that we have, that are values that we have, that we want to instill in our children as well. So this is I won't get into great detail about my farm because I want to talk about some bigger picture topics. But for example, this is a quarter of land that we were able to buy, that we put a house on here a few years ago. So this is land that we would never have managed as a family. It was under probably a 35, 40-year continuous or corn soybean rotation with conventional tillage, no livestock grazing whatsoever. And so this was the picture I took the fall before we closed on it. We closed on the land. This is the last crop that the previous tenant was raised on it. So this is what he had taken off. That long driveway in there on the top left, that's where our house is, about a quarter-mile long driveway. And when you think about what you want, one of the great kind of successes in life is to be able to manifest your values in the landscape around you. What do you want to see out your front yard every day? Okay? When you're driving home, right, to go home and your kids are there, what do they want you to see? And so if for those who are maybe unfamiliar with certain challenges, I saw a lot of really good looking black dirt on the way over from Minnesota, so this might be a little bit foreign to some of you folks. But these are saline areas. And so this was taken before soybean harvest. So everything you're seeing out there is prior to harvest. Those bare areas are not supporting any life whatsoever. And they're really not wetlands either, because they don't hold any real appreciable amount of water other than a really big rain event for a couple of days. So these saline seeps, essentially, the sodic soils become dead and lifeless. Not even kochia or foxtail barley will grow in the middle of these things. There's about 1.5 million acres in the state of South Dakota that are afflicted that look just like this. It's a major catastrophe. And it has happened with low residue crops, continuous tillage, lack of diversity in the landscape, lack of livestock grazing, and frankly, in most of these areas, it's just because they really shouldn't be farmed. They should be in perennial grasslands. It doesn't take very long turning these back into grasses and perennials for these to kind of completely restore themselves. In addition to that, we've got the wetlands that are in the middle there that are in a continuous drown-out situation that are holding weeds. Those would be non-saline areas. So we were able to, as a first-time land buyer, when we bought this place, we had to make payments, right? We had to make big payments. We had to go in the market, borrow money, and make payments. So how do you adopt the soil health practices that you want? How do you make those changes when you have a land payment that might be 2x what normal cash rent would be? How do you adopt in that environment? And so we were able to do a fair amount of things through EQIP, through the state or the county office there to allow that to happen. We put a bunch of different practices in place in this operation. We kind of completely transformed the entire quarter, and the whole land cost was about $475,000 to buy this quarter, not counting the acreage. And we signed a 3-year contract with an EQIP for $90,000 to be able to do fencing, water development, cover crops, no-till adoption, nutrient management plans, integrated pest management, et cetera. It was a major factor for us to be able to change so quickly. So I happened to wanted to go up here and take a picture 1 year later after we took over the property to see what it looks like just 1 year later. And so I know that the incentives aren't always the reason that people should be adopting soil health practices, but many times it is one of the things that allows it to happen. My wife and I, as a young family in a first-time land purchase, would not have been able to do many of the things that we did in this property without these types of incentives. So as you can see, we took the saline areas, we put a field border in there. That's a mix from Millborn Seeds. It's kind of like the Stockman, but it's a little bit modified, Alex. We put some other stuff in there that we wanted. Willow Lake is the home of the Pirates, so our purple and gold are our colors, and so I wanted some Falcata alfalfa and some yellow blossom and some purple blossom alfalfa with some Ladino clover. Those are the 3 school colors. So now if I let it get to kind of full bloom, I've got the kids' school colors in bright array down our driveway as they come home every day and as they take a bike ride. We're able to kind of encapsulate that entire thing with field borders. So the 30-acre chunk that you're looking at right here on this side of the driveway is actually pared down to a 22-acre field, but now I've got a nice 8-acre hay field for our sheep and our cattle operation. And when I run the numbers on what makes more profit, the field border or the inside of the field the last 3 or 4 years, it's been kind of a wash, right? So I haven't sacrificed anything from a profitability standpoint, except that first year when I made the transition, I'm not going to get my full 3 cuttings. I'm going to take a hit on that. That's where the incentives come into place. Didn't get up there this in time while it was still green to take a drone photo this year, but that little scar with the last saline areas, that's what it looks like getting covered up after 1 year. That's completely gone now. That's lush vegetation all the way through those areas that were no longer supporting life. On the top side of the driveway, that whole thing went into a similar hayfield, and then above that there was about a 17-acre pollinator habitat with 27 species of different pollinators plus about 7 species of native grasses that's going to turn into a pasture. We rested it for 2 years to kind of let it recover. It was a really ugly looking piece up there, and now it's one of our primary sheep pastures for the flock that we have at our place. So just going back one more time, and then 1 year later with just a different perspective on things. Some of these experiences and understanding where funding was coming from in the landscape prompted me and a few others to help start a company called AgSpire 3 years ago. We knew and we heard about all the different companies and some of the federal dollars that were going to be coming into play to increase soil health and regenerative practices on the land. And we wanted to be able to be in a position where we could help guide those into the most common sense, user-friendly programs that could be out there. We had a strong feelings that if groups of farmers didn't get together and come up with some definitions of what sustainability can look like in a farmer ranch, that the other companies were probably going to do it for us if we left them that void. So we started this as farmers and ranchers to help kind of drive what these programs could look like to make sure that they're win-wins once they come into implementation. Obligatory 5 principles of soil health, and I know many of you have seen this many times, but we're also welcoming all kinds of folks that come as newcomers to our soil health meetings. So I'll let you kind of read these on your own. They'll be in the slide deck that's available afterwards. But we need a way to bridge the gap in between the things that we talk about technically within soil health and agronomic improvements with those buzzwords that are happening amongst consumers and within food companies. We meet with a lot of different food companies with our work at AgSpire, and we work with many folks that are very engaged and understand what goes on in agriculture. We also meet with a lot of folks that work at food companies that don't get a chance to come to meetings like this, that don't get to come to farms. And as I tell people, if you think it's scary that consumers don't really understand where and how their food comes from, talk to an executive at a food company and find out they maybe don't really understand all the time where and how their food comes to them. And that's a lot scarier, right? Because those folks are making policy decisions and making decisions on what may be a step forward on land management and land use for their production and their practices that may not be grounded in either reality or it may not even be actually that productive. So how do we explain these kind of different terms to folks? It used to be 10 years ago even, if you mentioned conservation or conservation in agriculture, there really was no blending of those two terms. You basically had conservation and you had agriculture. So in all of our small towns in Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, you either did ag or you did conservation. You did CRP or you did agriculture. We didn't integrate those two things. They were two separate pathways. And then we started talking about conservation agriculture, and then we started talking about the soil health movement, and then we started talking about sustainability, and now we're mostly talking about regenerative ag. There's some talk about resilient ag. That may be the next buzzword that comes after that, and I don't know what all these things mean, but they're all kind of along the same thread. But what's the central theme behind all these? And I was trying to put it into terms that would help explain to someone what it meant, if they were a consumer, if they were just a citizen of our small towns that we operate in and around. So this last May, I gave a TED Talk in Sioux Falls about this. I talked about regenerative agriculture and kind of what it means. And a lot of these ideas are based off of a really good book I'd highly recommend by Darren Qualman called Civilization Critical. Has anybody heard of that book, Civilization Critical? It's a fantastic read, right? Would you agree? Incredibly complex way to try and, I shouldn't say it's complex, it's an incredibly well-stated way to explain complex systems and their interactions. So when I was giving this TED Talk in Sioux Falls, this is a highly urban audience, right, at TED. Not only was I the only person that gave an agriculture-related TED Talk that night, I was, I think, the only person that had ever given an agriculture-related TED Talk in the 10 years they've been doing that in the Sioux Falls venue. So basically tried to explain to anybody about what regenerative ag is first we have to step back and understand that agriculture in its essence is regenerative. All of agriculture has some level of regenerativeness to it. There's gradients of that, but there's not regenerative ag and non-regenerative ag with a hard line in the middle. And much of the infighting within the ag community, within the organic community versus the traditional community, or whatever it may be, different associations that might represent farm groups, is about trying to where draw the line is. We need folks to understand that there's only a few places that all the things come from. So if you go to Walmart or any Costco or any box store or anything that you can look at in this room, anything that you can buy or see or touch or purchase as a consumable only has just a few sources. The cornucopia of options that we have as consumers kind of belies the fact that our things all come from a few places. It either comes from the ground, from a mine, from an oil well or a natural gas well, or it comes of the land as farmed or forest products. That's it. Those are the only two options, with the exception of fresh caught fish and things like that. But all our things come from that. So when I explained to that audience in Sioux Falls that was really dressed up, it's kind of a nice event. Everybody's really dressed up. So when I explained to all those that the clothes that you're wearing either came from a regenerative system with a circular system, and I'll talk about that next, or from a finite system. You're either wearing a farm product or you're wearing oil, and there really isn't anything in the middle. So you can go back home tonight and you can look at your clothes and take off your tag. and seeing what it is. So first and foremost, if you're thinking about, as a consumer, buying regenerative things, at the very least, make sure it's from a farm, because a poorly managed farm is far more regenerative than any oil or natural gas well. Okay? And there's lots of different things that we can purchase as consumers that really can come from one of those two different categories. So a finite system is something that has a beginning stock, and the more you take of it, the less there is until it's gone. When you go to a copper mine, you take all the copper that you can out of there until the copper is gone. You can come back 10,000 years later, unless you've got some magma flows or something that are happening to replenish it, which is unlikely. There's no copper there. You can't ever make more copper into that site, okay? It's very different than a natural system. In nature, you can go to a perfectly balanced system where everything works. The wildlife, the plants, the animals, everything works, and if we don't touch it, everything works just fine, and everything maintains itself. But you can't come into a natural system like that, and you can't pick an apple off the tree or an acorn off the ground and take it out of there without minusculely disrupting the ability of that to kind of regenerate itself, right? You can only take so much out of those natural systems before you deplete them into exhaustion. You can take a little bit, but not much. You'd have to live in that system. Living in that system works, but then you're a part of the system, or you're on the land, not of the land. So conventional agriculture systems, or all agriculture, looks like this. We're weaving this linear system, and we're threading the needle between this regenerative cycle. All the main substrates there, energy, water, minerals, nutrient, carbon, life forms, are all cycling to some degree on all farms and ranches, some to a really high degree and some to a really low degree. But this is what we're driving to do. We take inputs and energy and materials, and we make products, and then we do have some waste within it. And really, regenerative agriculture is just a move to this. It's threading the needle tighter. It's trying to use less inputs on the outside, less outside inputs to make that happen. It's spinning the cycle faster, so we have more of the things that are creating it. Hopefully we have less waste on the back end, and an equal or greater amount of those actual products that we're actually looking for. But it's really just about increasing the size of that flywheel and cycling all those things to a better and higher degree. And then eventually, we have to get away from the abstract slides and look at that and says, okay, this is that pollinator habitat that I was talking to you about. I've taken saline soils that were essentially dead, that weren't growing anything. They're actually taking seed, taking chemical, taking fertilizer, and not giving me any output, and restoring that back into a system that I can now be able to capitalize as a forage source for the sheep operation, which builds income for us. So I do need to get into more of the funding opportunity. I just want to tell you a little bit about the perspective that I'm coming from when we're looking at these different types of things. So the current funding landscape, I want to talk about public funds first. So who in here has ever used any NRCS or CSP dollars on their farms? Quite a few? Yep, right, we all have. And there's been times where it's been difficult to access those. You know, in 2019 in South Dakota, there was 1,100 applications for CSP, and they only had funding for 110. So they had a 90% denial rate on folks that were applying for these voluntary programs in just 1 year in 2019. And in fact, the national average is around 50-50 for EQIP even, which was the best funded program about that time. Because of the low rate of acceptance and folks that had unfunded applications, and because there was a political environment to do so, there was a rampant increase in the amount of dollars that are going to go into your traditional NRCS programs over the next 5 to 6 years. It's attempting to make a baseline shift in the Farm Bill. This is supplemental funds today, but hopefully the hope is that these are baseline in the next Farm Bill to say they're kind of baked in the cake and they should be there. But basically it's somewhere around $20 billion that are going to be coming in. So this is what those funds look like. So we're just ending out 2023. We've had a small influx of these new funds coming in this year, but really starting next year, the year after that, and the year after that is when these funds will be very freely available. If you've ever had a trouble getting funded in the past or had a very large project that you'd like to see through, the next 2 to 3 years are going to be fantastic opportunities for you to get things funded that you need to do in your farm. There's 300, I'll talk a little bit more about EQIP later, but there's 300 and some different practices that EQIP can fund. Some of those are structural improvements for your farm or ranch, some of it's energy efficiency, some of it's soil health built and around, but it could be tree planting, it could be fences, it could be stream crossings. Just about anything you can think of is available to be funded in EQIP to make your farm build into the place that you want it to look like. Essentially, by about 2025, The total funds available for EQIP will be a little bit double what they normally are. For CSP, they'll be about 70% higher than they normally are. And then there's this new program in the red, I believe, in the red called RCPP. And RCPP basically didn't even exist until about 3 years ago. There's a few projects that got funded, and now it's becoming a major source. So there was just $1.1 billion of new funded projects within RCPP that was announced this fall. And they should, in the next few weeks, announce opportunities for another $1.8 billion that'll be open over the next 120 days for folks to apply. Those can be companies that are looking to get a regenerative ag system funded within their supply chain. They can be universities, they can be soil and water conservation districts, wildlife nonprofits, et cetera. We'll all have access to funds like that. So just a little bit, I mentioned it a couple times, but within EQIP, I mentioned this would be about a doubling of funding. EQIP typically covers between 70 and 90% of the costs. So for example, I'm going to go ahead just a little bit and come back. So this would be, I think for cover crop. Yep, so this is for cover crop and just a few key states. So $41 an acre is what that would pay in the state of Minnesota for a cover crop payment. You can make that payment go higher if you do a multi-species cover crop. Usually it's about $10 an acre higher. If you're a historically underserved producer in that category, and that can be a beginning farmer or a veteran farmer, it can be a person of ethnic minority, then there's actually a higher rate. It's about 15% higher if you're in the HU bucket for those kinds of payments. If you wanted to apply for EQIP and do cover crops in your farm and say, I'd like to do 400 acres of cover crops in my operation, every year for the next 3 years, you would go in, you would give some maps of vaguely where you want to put it, although you can move it around later with your county office, and you would get that funded, and then those funds would come in every year for the next 3 years, up to 200 acres or 400 acres, what you picked, onto your operation. Those applications are usually due in the fall. In Minnesota, I see it was due back in October, but they'll open up. You can sign up for it any time. Usually in the summertime, they'll tell you when the batching dates close. And it's usually around harvest time. It's usually, what I found, it seems like somehow it's usually right in the middle of the tail end of harvest where it's really hard to remember that you're supposed to go to the NRCS office to sign up for this. So I usually suggest to people that if you have intention to do so, do it prior to soybean and corn harvest so that you make sure you get in there. But again, there's about 300 different codes that can be funded within EQIP. Lots of different soil health activities, but as well as structural improvements and energy improvements on your farm or ranch. Lots of different projects for water, so for building water sources, for piping in water, tons of things for livestock grazing, infrastructure, management, et cetera. CSP was very popular a few years ago. It still is popular, but for a while there it looked like it was going to overtake EQIP in popularity, but the funding got cut a few years ago, so it's a little bit harder to get into CSP than it is in EQIP. In CSP, you pick more management type practices. So if you want to do more management improvements on your operation, CSP usually fits and pays a little bit better. If you want to do more infrastructure improvement on your operation, usually EQIP is a better choice. You can't get funded for the same things between EQIP and CSP, but it's generally good. The applications are due about the same time usually, and they can kind of help direct you at the county level on which one is best for you. So, and these rates are significantly lower for cover crop, but they come in a different way, right? So if you start looking at the price dockets, that's why there's such a disparity. So in CSP, you're going to get a payment per acre. So let's say you have a 1,000-acre farm, you want to do 400 acres of cover crops. In EQIP, it'll only going to pay you for the acres that are getting cover crop that year. And CSP is going to give you a payment for all the acres that are in your program, the 1,000 acres, regardless of whether they have cover crop or not, as long as 40% to 35% of them are getting a cover crop every year. So you can move things around a little bit easier. You'd have to get a cover crop, 2 to 3 years in that 5-year time frame. But you can apply for up to 5 years, a little bit longer than most EQIP contracts usually are. Also, there was a program that was launched a year and a half ago called Climate Smart Commodity Programs Partnerships. And that program had $3.1 billion of new funding to new projects. Most of those have been signed and enacted. I would say about half of them, in my experience, are open for people that apply for them today, where you could get into them. Some of those might be kind of specific to a commodity that you raise. They all have kind of a regional specificity. I'll explain a few of them that we're aware of that we kind of help implement in the state of Minnesota a little bit later on so you can get a feel for them. But really, most of these projects have kind of a private influence or a private backing with them as well as the government dollars. So the government dollars were leveraged by private companies putting in their commitment to add further dollars or further incentives within these programs to really get them off the ground and make them happen. I'll explain those in just a little bit. Interesting thing is, as we've had conversations with folks over the last few years, and this is kind of where the private companies coming in to make premiums in the marketplace, either for the practices and then not buying your products, or buying your products maybe through somebody else down the line but kind of not knowing exactly. I'll explain mass balance later. Or just for those practices overlaid with the product, okay? So in the past, most of those products, those premiums around products, were about how something was raised or grown. And it really was about giving up some technologies to some degree, and there's nothing against organic, but really it's not using certain legal available technologies that would be efficiency enhancing that consumers might not want to see used in their food production. They'll pay you a premium to be able to do that. If you look at on the cattle side of things, we have NHTC, right? So you can do everything, but just don't put a hormone implant in them, right? So then we have GAP, which is like you can do everything except for hormones and implants, or hormone implants as well as antibiotics. We don't see that either. And there's also some programs where it's like, well, you can use hormones, so you can do antibiotics, but we don't want you to feed any GMO feeds. We want non-GMO feed all the way through the life cycle, right? So it kind of gets confusing. But you think about the commonality of every one of those, it's all actually kind of just asking you to give up a legal available technology in order to build that premium. That's how almost all premiums in agriculture on the consumer level have been to so far. This new wave might be much more about this climate smart kind of distinction. It's much more about, are you sequestering more carbon than the average baseline in the products that we're producing? And if you are, we'll reward you for that. And you can use herbicides, and you can use whatever GMO technology if you want to, and all those things. You don't have to, but you can. We're paying you more for an outcome, a positive outcome, than we are for limiting the use of a technology that some consumers might pay a premium for to not have that used in the food system. Okay? This is a very different approach. And I shouldn't say that all these others in the past, because in the past this is what only was available. Now we'll have both of those available, both the left and the right-hand columns, not just one. Okay, if you haven't been tempted to fall asleep yet, now is your chance. We're going to explain scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, because if you've paid attention to this scope, you've heard about scope 3 emissions, scope 3 emissions, and scope 3 emissions in carbon. Well, what happened to scope 1 and 2, and why do we only care about 3? They care about 3 because as farms and ranches, we show up as someone's scope 3 emissions. If you were a farm, a ranch, and you decided that you want to go through and set a science-based target to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, you would go through the process of discovering your scope 1 and your scope 2 actual individual energy usage. To my knowledge, most of us have not done that and don't intend to in the near future, right? So we only show up as farms and ranches and as the products in scope 3. So when Starbucks says our scope 3 comes from dairy products and X amount comes from this and this, really direct is what the energy that they burn. So if you're buying diesel fuel, or if you're buying fuel to heat an office building, that kind of stuff, that's your direct emissions as a company. Scope 2 is the energy that's used to make those energy, right? So if you have energy sourced from wind towers, that has a different scope 3 impact than if you have energy that comes from a coal burning plant, okay? So hence wind towers and solar farms and et cetera. Scope 3 is everything else. And I remember a few years ago when I first started talking about thinking through this, scope 3, well, Starbucks said, hey, 87% of our emissions as a company are scope 3, and X amount of those come from coffee and dairy. And it was like a really high number. It was a scary high number, like, wow, farms and ranches produce 87% of the impact of emissions for a company like Starbucks. But then when you think about it, if Starbucks didn't have any agricultural products, they would just be a public restroom that had hot water, okay? So it makes a lot of sense that most of their emissions come from all the products that they sell to generate all the income that they have. So a lot of times the people will say, well, the agriculture, the farm level is so much of the emissions. And then I go back to the thinking of like, yeah, because all the things in the world come from a farm or a ranch or a mine or a drill, okay? So it makes sense that the thing that produces all the things that have to happen has a big part of the impact of the life cycle and not just the consumer phase of when it actually gets there. But if you hear about Scope 3 and why we're being included in that, we are Scope 3. If you wanted to do a Scope 1 and 2 assessment for your farm or ranch, you could, but most people are not. The Science-Based Targets community is giving guidance to companies on how to set emissions reducing targets. And I would say 3 years ago, 3 years ago, okay, there's a chart. All right, let's go by the chart. This is when this really ramped up. I remember in 2020, 2021, as we were starting with AgSpire, there was announcements like every day about somebody that was going to be carbon neutral, carbon negative, net zero, and decrease their emissions as a company by 30%. And by now, I would say that probably 90% of Fortune 500 companies have some science-based target met, which means they are promising to their shareholders and to their governing bodies, they're promising to their consumers and their employees that they're going to make these tangible impacts. And some of them are quite vocal about it. Like Apple, Tim Cook and Apple has come out and done a few commercials in the last 3 months where they're doubling down on it and says, we know it's going to be hard, but we're going to continue to do it anyway. We made these goals 2 years ago, and almost all of these hit by like 2030. There's some that are 2040, 2050, but most of these are 2030. So it's yet to see over the next 7 years as these companies try to assess on whether or not they're going to make good on their emissions claims, how serious they're going to be about putting incentives out there to get change to happen within their supply chains. So over the next 7 years, it'll tell us a whole bunch about what happens next. Some of these claims got outright ridiculous, okay? So it was all kind of trying to one-up somebody else. Somebody would say that we're going to reduce emissions by 30%, and the next person said that we're going to do it by 70%, and then Microsoft came out and said, we're not only going to eliminate all net emissions from our production, but we're going to go carbon negative. And by 2030, we're going to be carbon neutral, and between 2030 and 2050, we're going to be carbon negative to the point that it's going to wipe out all the emissions that have ever happened within Microsoft, going back to like 1978 or 79 or whenever it was founded, so that we are blameless as a company and we have nothing to apologize for over the climate, okay? When companies started to announce that they weren't just reducing emissions, but they were going to trap and capture emissions, the mentality changed. There's only a few ways to get carbon out of the atmosphere, CO2 or greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. You can build a large, enormous facility. Why does it be enormous? But you can build a manufacturing facility that sucks in the atmosphere and isolates the 0.04% of the atmosphere that's carbon dioxide. Isolate the 0.04%. Use energy to convert that from its gaseous form into a liquid form. Drill a hole in the ground, pump it down in there, cap it and monitor it for 100 years. It's called direct air capture, direct carbon capture for storage in air capacity. That has to run off energy. If you've ever studied physics or chemistry, you know that that doesn't happen for free. So you have to have enormous amounts of green energy to do that. But if you build solar panels to run the direct air capture facility, but you're still burning fossil fuels to run the electricity in your home, it doesn't make sense. So it makes more sense if you do create more green energy to direct the solar energy back onto the grid to displace fossil fuels than it does to burn it, to use it to capture the fossil fuels that were emitted. So you'd have to be in a place that is so over capacity on green renewable energy that it would make sense to do something like that. The only place on the planet, and you'll hear it talked about, and it'd probably be the only place on the planet that does this for a long, long time, is in Iceland, which has a surplus amount of geothermal energy. They're an island very far from anywhere else. It doesn't make sense to put it in a battery in a boat, so they have excess. There's 1 or 2 direct air capture facilities that are operating in Iceland that do a minuscule amount of work. Or, if you don't want to make a manufacturing plant, you could plant a plant. Because a plant is a solar-powered carbon capture machine that takes solar energy to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, rob the carbon to build itself, to build carbohydrates within itself, and then make that for a productive use. If you can pull that CO2 in within your crops, you can reduce tillage. You can plant a cover crop, which is like an additional solar-powered carbon sequestration field that's happening arbitrarily at the time. You're capturing additional carbon back into your field, and if you can leave it undisturbed and you can cycle it appropriately, you build soil organic matter. Soil organic matter is about 60% carbon by atomic weight, and your organic matter will build your carbon stocks in your soil. That's important because if you're going to actually do what Microsoft says they're going to do, you only have really two options. You can't just cut all your emissions. You can't just add all solar panels. You actually have to go negative. There's only two ways to go negative. There's three ways to go negative. The other one is called enhanced weathering. It's when you expose basalt rock to the air. It's moderately effective, but it's not super scalable. And you have to be really close to a basalt mine. And you also have to burn diesel fuel while you're crushing the basalt rock to get it to the field. So a few problems with that, but basically it's the main two. So if we're serious, if these companies are serious about removing CO2 to the atmosphere, and they've pledged billions of dollars, many of them, to do so, the most practical way that they're going to do that is by increasing the length of time in which a more diverse and abundant plant life is growing on top of surfaces in existing systems, otherwise known as cover cropping, polycropping, transitioning to perennial systems over annual systems, crop diversity, et cetera, et cetera. So when you think through where it goes next, most folks haven't realized, but they're going to have to come running to the ag community to do those kinds of things. There's a few people that have started. So there is, I'll get into insets and offsets in a little bit, but there's an example of some big companies that have kind of come together to say, this is how we're going to do it. And most of them agree that they're going to do voluntary incentive-based programs within the supply chain in order to promote soil health or carbon sequestering or carbon reducing activities, mostly where it comes down to. Okay, so insets versus offsets. Who here has heard of a carbon inset? Few. Okay. Who has heard of an offset? Offsets are more common. Okay, offset is when someone comes in outside of a supply chain to take a credit to use in their supply chain. If oil and natural gas is making an investment in a carbon offset in agriculture, they are coming in, they're going to take the credit of what's done within agriculture, they're going to certify it, they're going to remove it from the agriculture life cycle analysis, and they're going to take it and they're going to move it over to fossil fuels. So it's no surprise that the folks that have been thinking about climate change initiatives and the outcomes of it for the longest were the first ones to the market, come into agriculture wanting to buy our credits and move that over to theirs, okay? So the problem with that is, and it's where as agriculture we're a little bit to blame because we really didn't volunteer for this game. It's like a couple of our buddies drug us to a poker game that we didn't want to go to and sat us down, and here we are. And everybody sitting down here at this table represents the EPA pie graph where it shows that 9.6 of all emissions come from agriculture. And we're sitting there at this round table within our sector. And we're going 9.6%, this is ridiculous, they don't know what they're talking about, stuff like that. And then it's manufacturing and it's industry and it's all these other things. Okay? So we're sitting here at this poker game and all of our buddies have all looked at the cards while we sat up and went to the bathroom. And they know what agriculture's cards are because they've been playing this game for a lot longer. And they're all very much convincing us with our winning hand to not play the game. Don't ante up, don't look at your cards, walk away. You're right, this game is dumb. You just go walk away and we'll play it without you, okay? But the problem is that immediately they're coming into agriculture and saying, well, you guys are really bad. You know, beef is really bad for the environment, but we'll actually give you a carbon credit if you graze the crop aftermath on your field because we can count that to reduce our carbon emissions as a fossil fuel company, okay? Insets versus offsets. An inset is when you make an outcome that happens within agriculture and it stays within agriculture. The only people that can buy a carbon inset are those that actually buy your products eventually. Maybe not directly, but on a mass balance basis, meaning that they buy beef from the Midwest. So if you're a Midwestern beef producer, you can actually partake in that program, okay? It's very, very fundamentally differently. So offsets are when you sell your carbon rights to somebody else. Insets is a compensation to share, okay? It doesn't leave you. If you ever get to the point where you as a farm or ranch could be personally regulated from a carbon intensity standpoint, which I don't think actually will happen. Even looking at politics and stuff, in the US we've taken a very different path, but I don't think that will happen. But if it were to, if you sold offsets, they're gone, you don't get them. But if you were compensated to share an inset, it's part of your life cycle analysis of your products. It's perfectly fine for you to count those practices within what you do. It's a big distinction. If you're looking at doing carbon credits, I would say a fundamental question to the person that's doing them is this an inset or this is an offset? And if they don't have a very clear answer to that, then it's probably an offset. Or it could be they sell both, but it's mostly offsets and some insets, okay? Insets promote agriculture and promote the impact that happens within our products. Offsets use our products as a supplemental income, and it's not, if you want to do it, it's fine. I just want people to explain and understand what the ramifications of it are. It will leave agriculture and go to another sector. It'll let Microsoft feel so good about themselves that they're completely carbon negative. At the same time, they will not serve beef in their cafeteria or maybe any animal protein whatsoever because animal protein is bad for the planet, even if they relied on animal protein production to provide them with the offsets that allow them to be carbon negative. The other thing about carbon programs and new programs in the future is understanding mass balance. Mass balance is how a company that doesn't really know if they do or do not buy from you, if you sell grain to a local elevator, the local elevator sends it onto a bigger elevator, it gets moved, it gets shuffled around, you don't know where it goes, but they buy corn from Minnesota, they can make a payment to a producer that grows corn in Minnesota if they buy corn from Minnesota. It's kind of a little loophole here where it allows companies that want to make an impact. This is a big net benefit actually to small farms and ranches because traceability can be a major obstacle for some commodities to be able to do so. It's actually a really good way for them to be able to make those impacts. Other funding programs that might come up outside of the two big buckets, the private stuff and the public stuff, is all these other groups that we would happen to interact with. And there really is, a few years ago, there was 19 different programs that you could use in, say, South Dakota to plant degraded farmland back to a perennial. And those 19 programs were housed by 6 different governmental agencies, 4 NGO, nonprofit conservation groups, and 1 private company. So if you wanted to understand all your options, you had to make 11 phone calls, right, to know what program might work for you. Part of that process of understanding the complexity of all these different programs led us to found and become and start AgSpire, okay? We knew that it was becoming increasingly complex, and we knew that the companies were going to need a lot of help on how to make quality programs for things like insets within their supply chains. So if you go to agspire.com, AgSpire, and go to Sustain Ag Network, you can sign up with your name, email address, a few quick questions on what commodities you raise, and we can give you information about certain programs that would be available, and all these programs would be available only through AgSpire. They wouldn't be available at your local NRCS office, they wouldn't be available from anywhere else online. They're ones that we manage. We have some climate smart commodity grants. We have 5 that we manage ourselves. We have some market-based programs. Some of these are non-subsidized at all. They're purely funded by companies that want to see change in there. One of the ones I'll talk about, and I won't talk about all of them, but I have a small case study on this one that I'll share just a slide on. This is Grass is Greener. So this is an $80 million project that'll last over the next 5 years. We'll be able to enroll about 300 different ranches in South Dakota, Minnesota, and surrounding states. So if you're in the program, you'll have access to up to 200 acres of these cost shares for planting these seedings on your program. They come from AgSpire. Our landowner advisors and TSPs will help you understand what the right thing is to put on each acre. And you're available for any one of these. Those forage and range plantings, they can be new seedings. When I say forage planting, I mean a perennial forage planting, a grass alfalfa mix, kind of like my field border. Or they could be overseedings, right? You could take an almost all grass hay piece and put clovers and alfalfas in there to increase the diversity of it. So those can be interseeding or they can be new seedings on those. And then in addition to those kind of payments, there would actually be a $40 per head calf incentive, no matter where you sell your calves to. When you sell your feeder calves or when you finish them out, a $40 per head incentive within and on top of that. We'll do soil testing around that. South Dakota State University will do soil testing around that. We'll do verification of the practices. We'll come back, we'll do a baseline before you plant or right after you plant. We'll come back a few years later, up to 5 years later on the perennial seedings and retest them again to understand what the impact is. And then we'll seek partners that are within the food supply chain that want to further invest in programs like this to make it an ongoing thing in the future so that we can generate premiums for livestock as well as practice payments on an ongoing basis. So in this program, if you look on the right-hand side, this is based on a partnership that I have with my neighbor. We've got about 185 beef cows that we cab out every year. There's some farm ground associated with it as well. But we'll want to do an additional 100 acres of cover crops this next year, and then we've got an 80-acre piece that we want to do forage planting, and then we've got some buffer strips that we want to put in. So we'll have about $13,000 in incentives that will be coming into this partnership to do the practices that we really wanted to do anyway. Some we do on an annual basis, some are kind of a one-time need. And then our 171 head of feeder calves that we would be selling here in February, like next year it'll be like this. There'd be a $40 per head premium, which overall is about $19,800. And I have it down there, there's two of us as partners, so about $10,000 per partner in incentives. So when I explained to this, that 82% in net revenue, I actually went through and did all my costs for myself as an operation and found out that when I put all my labor in there, even though feeder calves are like record high prices, I'm still only making about $100 a head, which is actually pretty good for a cow-calf operation because they're generally low return operations. So I'm making $100 a head. If I'm making $100 a head and I'm in a program that can add $80-some, $90-some in total premiums on a per head basis, I'm increasing my net revenue by almost 100%, right? Because my net's 100. If I can add another 100, 90 to 100 in other ways. So the calf premium as well as the incentives are really instrumental to drastically increasing my net revenue at the end of the day. So that's a program that we'll have for about 300 different operations. We've got about 50 people signed up so far. There is a few slots open for this next year, 2024, but then 2025 and the next year we'll be adding more participants all the time. I've got to kind of wrap this up, and I want to make sure I have a chance to do one or two questions. So we do have another program that is based off of people that are raising oats, rye, flax, buckwheat, winter camelina. Is available there. Similar kind of incentives, $30 an acre for cover crops, and then about 10 to 15% premium on the actual crops themselves based on market prices. So if you're involved in growing any of those kinds of crops, make sure to sign up. We've got some other market-based programs with companies that are described here. Those are not funded by any grant or anything like that. They're just kind of able to sign up for. Some of those are herd management improvements on beef cow operations, so actually making reductions through more efficient operations. We'll have consultants that come out and help people, find ways to do earlier pregnancy diagnosis, better genetic selection, gender skew in the calf through artificial insemination, things like that, that'll actually create claimable impacts for folks like McDonald's that want to see that happen to lower their impact in their greenhouse gases. Okay, I think I'm getting really close. Yes, I'm at the end. Okay, so that is where you might go to find out more about those various programs that I talked about at the end. But I am open for questions if I have a little time. Time for a couple? Okay.